alien horror industries license human concepts because our imagination exceeds all others. Part 1. The convention hall stretched across 3 kilometers of polished metal floors and transparent walls that looked out into the stars. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds moved between booths, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, harmonics, and translated speech. The Galactic Entertainment Consortium held this gathering once every standard year, and it was the most important event in the fear entertainment industry. Aura moved through the crowd with practiced ease, their translucent bodies shifting through subtle color changes that indicated professional interest. As chief fear analyst for the consortium, they had attended 23 of these conventions. They knew what to expect. The IC would showcase their latest predator memory simulations, which tapped into the genetic fear their species carried from their apex hunters. The crystalline choir would perform sonic compositions that induced existential dread through frequencies that resonated with the basic structure of conscious thought. The would demonstrate shape-shifting performances that exploited evolutionary fears common to most carbon-based life forms. Nothing ever really changed. Each year brought minor improvements to established formulas, but the core concepts remained the same. Aura had written papers on the fundamental limits of fear entertainment, arguing that all species drew from the same basic well of survival instincts. There were only so many ways to scare someone. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The human booth sat in the back corner of the hall, a modest setup that most attendees had walked past without a second glance. Aura only noticed it because they made a point of visiting every exhibitor, even the newcomers. Humans had joined galactic society just 20 years ago, barely enough time to understand the markets, let alone contribute anything meaningful to them. Still, courtesy demanded at least a brief visit. A human male stood behind a simple display table. He wore what Aura's translation software identified as business casual attire, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his brown eyes bright with nervous energy. A name tag identified him as representing Terran Nightmares LLC. "Welcome," said, his voice carrying the slightly odd cadence that came from speaking through a universal translator. "I'm glad someone finally stopped by. Would you like to see what we've brought?" Aura's colors shifted to polite yellow. "Of course. What does your company offer?" "Horror entertainment," said. "Specifically, we hold the licensing rights to several thousand human horror properties. Films, books, games, immersive experiences. We're hoping to find partners interested in adapting them for galactic audiences." Aura managed not to let their colors slip into condescending orange. Every species thought their fear concepts would translate well. Most didn't. That's quite ambitious for a species so new to the market. What makes human horror entertainment unique? Smiled, it was not a comfortable expression. "Why don't I show you? Do you have 5 minutes to watch a short presentation?" Professional obligation kept Aura from declining. They moved around the table to where had set up a small viewing screen, designed to be compatible with most species' visual processing. Tapped a few controls, then stepped back. "This is a trailer for one of our classic films," he said. "It's called The Thing." The screen activated. Aura watched, expecting crude jump scares or simple predator imagery. Instead, they saw something that made their chromatophores freeze in confused purple. The footage showed a research station in an ice-covered wasteland. Humans, isolated and trapped. Then something arrived, something that could perfectly imitate any living being. The horror wasn't in the creature itself, but in what it represented. No one could be trusted. Your closest friend might already be the monster. Your own body might betray you at any moment. The fear came not from threat of death, but from the complete destruction of social bonds, from isolation within a group, from the knowledge that your senses and judgment could not protect you. When the trailer ended after 4 minutes, Aura's colors had cycled through shades that their species associated with profound cognitive dissonance. They had never encountered this specific flavor of fear before. It was elegant, sophisticated, terrifying in a way that bypassed every defense mechanism their evolution had built. "What was that?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Leaned forward. "That's paranoia horror, the fear of the familiar becoming hostile. We have entire genres built around it. Body horror, where your own flesh becomes the enemy. Cosmic horror, where you confront things too vast to comprehend. Psychological horror, where the threat is internal. We've been refining these concepts for thousands of years." Ara's analytical mind kicked back into gear. "Show me more." Over the next hour, presented sample after sample. He showed clips from films about artificial intelligence turning against creators, about ordinary people becoming monsters, about diseases that destroyed civilization, about children who were not quite human, about houses that trapped their occupants, about the emptiness between stars hiding impossible geometries. Each concept was different. Each approached fear from a unique angle that Ara had never imagined. By the time finished, a small crowd had gathered. A IC executive stood at the edge of the booth, their sensory tendrils quivering. 3 members of the crystalline choir had formed a tight harmonic cluster, their usual perfect pitch wavering with distress. A scout kept shifting forms rapidly, a sign of deep agitation. "How?" the IC executive asked, pushing forward. "How does your species conceive of such varied terrors?" Glanced at the growing crowd, then back at his display. "I think it's because Earth is what the galactic classification system calls a death world. Not the most dangerous, but definitely in the top tier. Humans evolved as both predator and prey. We survived ice ages, plagues, megafauna, and each other. Our brains are wired to constantly imagine threats because that's what kept us alive. And once we developed culture and storytelling, we turned that survival instinct into art." A being from a species Ara didn't recognize spoke up, their voice translated as dry and academic. "You're saying your horror entertainment is based on actual trauma?" "Not exactly," said. "It's based on the deep understanding that anything can go wrong, that safety is temporary, that the universe is hostile and other people can be the greatest danger of all. But we process that understanding through fiction, through controlled fear. It helps us cope with reality by practicing in imagination." The crystalline choir member who served as their spokesperson emitted a complex harmonic. "You seek out fear voluntarily. You pay currency to experience terror." "Yes," said simply. "We have haunted houses where people walk through scary scenarios for fun. We tell ghost stories to children. We create elaborate fictional monsters and then enjoy being afraid of them. It's part of our culture, across every human society that ever existed." Ara's colors settled into a deep, thoughtful blue. They understood, suddenly, what they were witnessing. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a window into how a death world species processed existence, and the implications for the fear entertainment industry were staggering. "I need to contact my superiors," Ara said. "Mister, would you be willing to discuss licensing agreements?" Smile widened. "That's why I'm here." By the end of the convention day, had fielded over 200 inquiries. Major studios wanted to adapt Stephen King novels. Networks wanted the rights to horror film franchises. Game developers wanted concepts for immersive experiences. Everyone wanted a piece of humanity's nightmare factory. The IC executive, whose name translated as approached as the crowds thinned. "I want to be frank, mister. My studio has dominated the fear entertainment market for 3 centuries. We thought we understood horror. After seeing your presentations today, I realize we've been creating children's content by comparison. How much would exclusive rights to your top-tier properties cost?" Pulled up a data pad and began scrolling through figures. "That depends on what you consider top-tier. We have properties that range from simple slasher films to complex psychological narratives. Some of our best work is in literature rather than visual media. And then there's the question of whether you want adaptation rights or just licensing for direct translation." All of it said, I want access to all of it. That's going to be expensive, warned. I don't care about the cost, replied. I care about staying relevant. After today, every studio in the galaxy is going to be scrambling for human horror content. The company that secures the best properties first will dominate the next century of entertainment. Ara watched the negotiations with fascination. In one day, humanity had gone from unknown newcomers to the most sought-after content creators in the galaxy. And they had done it not through technology or military might, but through imagination shaped by survival on a world that tried to kill them at every turn. The question now was what would happen when the rest of the galaxy gained access to nightmares refined by thousands of years of human creativity. Ara suspected the entertainment industry would never be the same. They were right, but they had no idea how deep the changes would go. Part 2. 6 months after the convention, the galaxy was experiencing what entertainment journalists called the human horror revolution. Every major network had at least one human-licensed property in production. The financial reports were staggering. Earth's horror intellectual property had become the planet's second-largest export by value, trailing only educational materials. Small Studio had transformed into a galactic corporation practically overnight. He now worked out of offices on 3 different worlds, managing a team of 50 licensing specialists. Every day brought new contract negotiations, adaptation consultations, and increasingly desperate offers from studios that had missed the first wave of acquisitions. The IC studios had paid more than most planetary defense budgets for exclusive adaptation rights to Stephen King's complete works. Their first production was a holographic theater experience based on it, and they had struggled to understand why the concept worked. Had called 3 times in the first week of production alone. Explain to me again, had said during the last call, why a creature that takes the form of a children's entertainer is terrifying to species that have never encountered circuses or clowns. Had leaned back in his chair trying to find the right words. It's not about the specific form, it's about the violation of trust. Children's entertainers are supposed to be safe, friendly, protective. When something evil wears that mask, it corrupts a symbol of innocence. The horror comes from the betrayal of expectation, not from the physical appearance itself. But we don't have that cultural context, had protested. You don't need it, had said. The underlying principle translates. Find something your species considers inherently safe and trustworthy, then reveal it's actually dangerous. The specifics change, but the emotional impact remains the same. The holographic production had premiered 2 weeks ago. Critics across a dozen species called it the most unsettling entertainment experience they had ever witnessed. Ticket sales had broken records. The IC Studio's stock value had increased by 40%. But not everything was positive. Reports of adverse psychological reactions had begun filtering through official channels. The Crystalline Choir had licensed the entire found footage genre, creating immersive experiences where participants didn't realize the horror had begun until they were deep into the scenario. 3 participants from a species called the had experienced complete psychological breakdowns after a Blair Witch Project adaptation. They couldn't process the concept of building fear through absence rather than presence of threat. Dr. A Renowned had published a paper that was causing serious discussion in academic circles, had read it twice, finding her arguments both flattering and disturbing. She called it the human fear paradox, and her central thesis was elegant in its simplicity. Most species, she argued, developed entertainment to provide positive emotional experiences: joy, satisfaction, triumph, connection. Negative emotions were things to be avoided, not sought out. But humans had built an entire entertainment industry around deliberately inducing fear, disgust, dread, and horror. They paid money to feel terrible in controlled environments. This was unprecedented in galactic history. Research suggested that this came from humanity's unique evolutionary path. Humans had existed in a state of constant threat for most of their species' history. They were smart enough to imagine all the ways things could go wrong, but not powerful enough to prevent those things from happening. So they developed psychological coping mechanisms, one of which was practicing fear in safe contexts. Horror entertainment was exposure therapy turned into culture. The paper had sparked a fierce debate. Some academics argued that human horror was actually therapeutic, that other species might benefit from controlled fear experiences. Others warned that exposing non-human psychology to concepts it hadn't evolved to handle was dangerous and potentially unethical. The practical consequences came faster than had expected. A collective species, beings who lived their entire lives as part of a hive mind, had watched an adaptation of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The concept of individuals being replaced while maintaining the appearance of normalcy had triggered a cascading crisis. How could they trust their shared consciousness when the fiction presented the possibility of hostile infiltration of identity itself? 3 members of the collective had attempted to sever their connection to the hive mind, convinced they might be compromised. The resulting psychological trauma had required extensive intervention. The collective government had banned all human horror content and filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Ethics Committee. Similar incidents followed. A species that reproduced through metamorphosis banned the fly after widespread panic about transformation. Beings who lived in symbiotic relationships with other organisms couldn't handle venom or the thing. Species without individual concepts of death found zombie apocalypse scenarios incomprehensible but deeply disturbing in ways they couldn't articulate. Found himself giving interviews to galactic news services, trying to explain human psychology to beings who found it alien and threatening. "We're not trying to weaponize fear," he told an interviewer from the Crystalline Choir. "These stories serve a purpose in human culture. They help us process anxiety about death, about society breaking down, about losing control of our own bodies and minds. We're not afraid of these things happening because we've already imagined them happening and surviving them in fiction." But other species haven't built those same psychological frameworks, the interviewer responded, their harmonic structure carrying undertones of concern. "You're introducing conceptual threats that we have no cultural immune system against." Had no good answer to that. He was a businessman and a creative professional, not a. He understood human horror because he was human, translating that understanding to species who had never known predation, scarcity, betrayal, or mortality in the way humans experience these things was beyond his expertise. The Galactic Ethics Committee announced formal hearings on the matter, was summoned to testify, along with, and representatives from a dozen affected species. Earth's government took the situation seriously enough to send Ambassador Sarah, one of humanity's most skilled diplomats. Meanwhile, the business continued. They had launched a research initiative to understand human horror at its source. They sent teams to Earth, studying human history, psychology, and culture. One researcher, a being named, spent 3 months embedded with a human university's anthropology department. His report, when it came back, was sobering. Humans, they wrote, had survived conditions that would have driven most species extinct. Ice ages that lasted tens of thousands of years. Plagues that killed substantial portions of their population. Megafauna predators that hunted them. Volcanic eruptions that nearly wiped them out entirely. And through it all, they had faced a threat that most species never experienced at their species level: other humans. Human civilization was built on cooperation, but human history was written in conflict. Humans knew, on a deep cultural level, that their greatest threat often came from their own kind. This knowledge informed their fiction in ways that made it devastatingly effective. When a human created a story about society collapsing or neighbors turning hostile, they were drawing on actual historical memory, not abstract speculation. Red's report in his office, looking out at the alien cityscape beyond his window. He had never thought of human history as particularly unusual. Every species faced challenges during their evolution. But seeing it through perspective, he began to understand why human horror hit so differently for other species. Humans had evolved to expect disaster. They had survived by imagining every possible threat and preparing for it. Their horror fiction was an extension of that survival trait, refined over thousands of years of storytelling. Other species had evolved in more stable environments or with different survival strategies. They simply didn't have the same relationship with fear. The hearing was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Knew that the outcome would determine whether humanity's horror entertainment remained a galactic phenomenon or became a cautionary tale about cultural incompatibility. He also knew that whatever happened, the galaxy had already changed. You couldn't see the nightmares humanity had shown them. In a strange way, thought that was the most human thing of all. Humans didn't just survive their fears, they shared them. They turned them into art, into connection, into stories that said, "You're not alone in being afraid." Whether the galaxy was ready for that gift was another question entirely. Part 3. The Galactic Council Chamber was designed to accommodate representatives from hundreds of species, each in their own environmental section suited to their biology. Ara attended as the chief fear analyst who had first encountered human horror entertainment. They sat in a transparent observation sphere, their chromatophores shifting through nervous patterns. The proceedings began with testimony from affected species. A collective representative described the identity crisis that had swept through their population after exposure to invasion of the body snatchers. A survivor of the Blair Witch experience recounted the terror of not knowing when the horror had begun, of reality and fiction blurring, until they couldn't trust their own perceptions. The testimonies were compelling and disturbing. Several council members began discussing immediate restrictions on human horror content. Some suggested banning it entirely outside of Earth. Then Doctor took the stand. Her testimony was measured and academic, but her conclusions were radical. "We are approaching this situation incorrectly," she said. "The question is not whether human horror is dangerous. Of course it's dangerous. All effective entertainment carries some risk. The question is whether the danger outweighs the potential benefits." She brought up data on her display, visible to all council members. Since human horror content became widely available, we've seen a 23% increase in disaster preparedness planning across incorporated worlds. Military strategists report improved threat assessment capabilities. Medical researchers have begun modeling pandemic scenarios they had never considered. Why? Because human horror has taught us to ask, what if things go wrong? A council member from the Serene hierarchy spoke up, their voice translated as calm and measured. "You're arguing that content which has caused documented psychological harm is beneficial." "I'm arguing that it's a tool," replied. "Like any tool, it can harm if misused. But consider what human horror actually represents. It's the product of a species that survived by imagining threats and preparing for them. Every human horror story is, at its core, a thought experiment in disaster preparedness." Ambassador Sarah requested permission to speak. The council granted it, and she moved to the central platform. She was a tall woman with graying hair and the kind of steady presence that came from decades of diplomatic service. Watching from the public gallery, felt his anxiety ease slightly. If anyone could make the council understand, it was her. "Honorable council members," Sarah began, "I want to tell you about something we do on Earth. When human children are young, they instinctively create imaginary fears. Monsters under the bed, creatures in the closet, shadows that move wrong. Parents used to think this was a problem to be fixed, but developmental psychologists discovered something interesting. Children who are allowed to engage with their imaginary fears, who are taught to process fear in safe contexts, develop better emotional resilience and threat assessment skills." She paused, letting the translation software catch up. Human horror entertainment is the adult version of this developmental process. We practice fear. We expose ourselves to terrible scenarios in controlled environments because it prepares us for the reality that life is unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. This isn't a quirk of human psychology. It's a survival adaptation. A council member from a species didn't recognize spoke up. But we are not humans. Our species did not evolve in such hostile environments. Why should we adopt your coping mechanisms? Because the universe is hostile, Sarah said simply. Not all species encountered that hostility during their evolution, but it exists nonetheless. Climate change, pandemics, technological accidents, resource scarcity, first contact with aggressive species. These are universal threats, not human-specific ones. Human horror gives you frameworks for thinking about these possibilities before they occur. The researcher requested to speak. The council recognized them, and their form shifted into something roughly humanoid, a gesture of respect toward the subject of discussion. I spent months studying human culture and history. What I discovered alarmed me at first, but I came to understand it. Humans are, psychologically, a species in a state of permanent low-level crisis preparation. They assume disaster is always possible. This seems paranoid until you examine their history and realize they're absolutely correct to think this way. Brought up their own data. Look at these patterns. Humans who regularly engage with horror entertainment show increased activity in brain regions associated with problem-solving and scenario planning. They're not just being scared. They're training themselves to think through crisis situations. The humans who created stories about pandemics helped their species respond more effectively to actual pandemics. The humans who wrote about artificial intelligence dangers helped their programmers build better safeguards. Horror fiction is futurism with a pessimistic lens, and pessimistic futurism is valuable. The debate continued for hours. Representatives argued about content warnings, psychological screening, age restrictions, and species-specific adaptations. The collective insisted on complete bans. The IC argued for market freedom. Smaller species worried about being culturally overwhelmed by human content. Finally, the council called for a recess to deliberate, left the chamber and found Sarah in one of the side corridors. "How do you think it went?" he asked. Sarah smiled tiredly. "Better than I expected and gave us good groundwork. The council doesn't want to ban human content entirely. They're just afraid, which is ironic given the circumstances." "Afraid of what?" "Of being changed," Sarah said. "Human horror doesn't just scare people. It changes how they think. Once you've been exposed to the concept that your neighbor might be replaced by a hostile duplicate, you can't know that possibility. Once you've considered what happens if your technology turns against you, you can't go back to blind trust. Human horror is psychologically invasive in a way that most galactic entertainment isn't." Nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" "Now we wait for the council to decide whether that invasion is worth it." The council reconvened 3 hours later. The judgment was complex, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered something to everyone. Human horror content would remain legal but subject to strict regulation. Psychological screening would be mandatory for audiences. Content would be rated not just by intensity but by conceptual type, with warnings specific to species vulnerabilities. The collective ban would stand, but most other restrictions would be lifted. More interestingly, the council authorized the creation of a new institution, the Terran Horror Classification Board, to be staffed jointly by human experts, and its purpose was to help other species adapt human horror content appropriately and to develop best practices for cross-species fear entertainment. But the real surprise came at the end. The council recommended that human horror consultants be made available to galactic military, medical, and disaster response organizations. If human imagination could conceive of threats that other species missed, then that imagination could be weaponized for prevention rather than entertainment. found himself appointed to the classification board. Ara joined as well, their expertise in fear analysis making them invaluable. Together with, and a dozen other specialists, they began the work of building frameworks for responsible cross-species horror entertainment. The following year's Galactic Entertainment Consortium convention was different from any that had come before. The human booth was now the largest in the venue, a sprawling complex that took up an entire section of the convention hall. But notice something that pleased him more than any sales figure could. A young IC filmmaker was presenting their own original work, a horror piece about a character who feared they were becoming too much like another species, losing their identity in the process. The Crystalline Choir had composed a symphony exploring the silence between stars, the vast emptiness that most species avoided thinking about. A collective had created a story about beings who could no longer change in a universe that demanded constant adaptation. They were creating their own horror now, using human concepts as templates but exploring fears specific to their own experiences and biology. Human horror hadn't replaced galactic entertainment. It had taught other species how to confront their own fears creatively. Doctor visited the convention on its final day. She walked through the exhibits with observing the crowds, the reactions, the careful blending of human and alien concepts. "You did something remarkable," she told him. "You taught the galaxy to be afraid." Shook his head. "We taught them that fear can be useful, that confronting it makes you stronger, that the species which can imagine disaster is the species that can prepare for it." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," said, "because they're not just consuming our horror anymore. They're creating their own. They're taking the tools we gave them and using them to explore their own shadows. That's not cultural imperialism. That's cultural evolution." A Crystalline Choir member approached them, their harmonics carrying tones of gratitude. "Mister, I wanted to thank you. Before your species introduced horror entertainment, we focused all our art on harmony and beauty. We avoided dissonance. But I've learned that dissonance has value. It teaches us to appreciate harmony more deeply. And sometimes, dissonance is the only appropriate response to the universe's chaos." After they left, Sarah turned to, "You know what the real horror story is, the one we're living." "What's that?" "That humanity had to survive hell to learn how to imagine it. We paid for our horror in blood and suffering. But now we're teaching the galaxy these lessons without them having to experience the same trauma. We're giving them our scars without the wounds." Consider that. Is that good or bad? "Both," Sarah said. "Like all the best horror stories. The question is whether they'll use what we've taught them to avoid the disasters we survived, or whether knowing about the darkness will somehow make it more likely to happen. We've shown them monsters. Now we have to hope they can handle what they've seen." The convention ended, returned to Earth for a brief vacation, his first in over a year. He spent a week in his old apartment, rewatching classic horror films, remembering why he had started this business in the first place. Horror entertainment had always been about more than fear. It was about catharsis, about confronting mortality and chaos and emerging intact on the other side, about looking at the darkness and refusing to let it consume you. The galaxy was learning those lessons now. Some would handle it better than others. Some would create beautiful, terrifying art from their new understanding. Others would struggle with concepts their evolution hadn't prepared them for, but they would all be changed. Thought about that as he watched The Thing again, this film that had started everything. The story of paranoia and isolation, of trust betrayed and bodies violated. The story that had made Ara's colors freeze in confused purple. The story that had opened the floodgates. In the end, he thought, the most human thing was not surviving horror. It was the instinct to share it, to say to the darkness, "I see you, and I will not let you have the final word." To turn fear into art and art into connection. Humanity had given the galaxy nightmares, but they had also given them the courage to look fear in the face and say, "Tell me a story about it." And in that gift, despite all its complications and consequences, there was something beautiful, something very human. The galaxy would never be quite the same, neither would humanity's place in it, but found himself smiling as the credits rolled. They had done what humans had always done. They had survived by sharing their survival strategies. They had made art from trauma. They had turned their worst fears into their greatest export. The universe was hostile. It always had been. But now the galaxy knew that, and knowing was the first step to preparation. Human horror had taught them to imagine disaster. What they did with that knowledge would determine whether humanity's gift was a blessing or a curse. Suspected it would be both, like all the best horror stories.